This is a special report from Skywatch TV. I'm Derek Gilbert. You know by now that this morning, Saturday, October 7th, 2023, the nation of Israel was caught by surprise as Hamas launched thousands of rockets from Gaza into Israeli territory. As of this recording, some 150 Israelis dead. The IDF confirming that in addition to the rockets, there were incursions on the ground from the Gaza Strip into border communities in the Negev, with dozens of Israelis, perhaps as many as 50, abducted and taken back into Gaza. The Israel police force confirming that there were confrontations, engagements with Hamas terrorists in 22 Israeli communities in the southern part of the country, again along the border with Gaza. This took place on the 50th anniversary of the Yom Kippur War of 1973. I think we in the West, here in the United States especially, have very short memories, and we tend to ignore anniversary dates like this. We can't conceive of the emotion or the justification for the kind of mentality that would convince young men of fighting age that they are somehow justified in going into a community and taking women, children, and the elderly from their homes, abducting them at gunpoint, in some cases just shooting them on sight, and then dragging them back into Gaza to hold for ransom. This speaks to the nature of the conflict that we're dealing with here. It is not just physical. I mean, as Paul wrote to the church at Ephesus, we're not wrestling against human opponents. We wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities and powers and cosmic rulers over this present darkness. This is a spiritual war that is playing out in front of us in Israel today. And we ask you to pray for peace in Israel on all sides, and that the families that have been separated during this conflict just hours ago will be reunited with no further loss of life. Again, as of this recording, some 150 Israelis confirmed dead in the rocket attacks and the gunfire, the gun battles that have taken place, with more than 1,000 injured at this point. Tel Aviv is now coming under rocket attack. Dozens of rockets have been reported aimed at Tel Aviv, and even Jerusalem reported that air raid sirens have sounded there as well. So this is a fluid situation. Obviously, we are not equipped to give you breaking news, but trying to give you some context for understanding what is going on here. Again, I say that we in the West tend to ignore these historic dates, but I assure you, in the Islamic world, they do not. 50 years ago, 1973, the Yom Kippur War took place. We talked about it earlier this week in the context of the date on the Julian calendar, the calendar that we use in the West, the 50th anniversary, but on the Jewish calendar, this is the 50th anniversary as we're recording this today. Benjamin Netanyahu saying this morning that Israel is at war. They're not calling this a limited operation. They have basically declared that this is a war. And 50 years ago, 1973, Anwar Sadat, the leader of Egypt at that time, sent his troops across the Suez Canal into the Sinai Peninsula, trying to reclaim it, recapture it after the 1967 war when Israel took it from Egypt. His troops were successful, more successful than they should have been. The same was true in the north, as Syrian forces, armored forces, crossed the Golan Heights so quickly that they were in Tiberias on the west shore of the Sea of Galilee within a day. In fact, they conquered so much, captured so much territory so quickly, they were convinced the Israelis were laying a trap and had planned to encircle them and then destroy them, which allowed Israel time to recover, regroup, and counterattack, which then regained the lost territory. Israel was on its back foot back in 1973. There are some reports now, 50 years later, that this was due in part to the Nixon administration, and specifically Henry Kissinger, who warned Golda Meir not to strike preemptively, even though the Egyptian forces were seen building up along the Suez Canal. Kissinger reportedly thought that Israel was getting too big for its britches, and in the interest of maintaining a balance of power, as though it were America's right to determine who holds power in the Middle East, Israel was basically told not to attack preemptively or else. Now, what has happened here 50 years later on the 50th anniversary of this? We don't know. How is it possible that Mossad, Shin Bet, and the IDF were all taken by surprise? I'm sure those are questions that the Knesset and that the people of Israel will want answered very, very soon. The Netanyahu administration now taking the fight into Gaza. IDF airstrikes have been reported in Gaza. There are also reports along the northern border that Hezbollah militants, terrorists, were approaching the border on motorcycles and were fired on by IDF soldiers. So this conflict, we pray, will not spread, but that remains to be seen. Again, this taking place on the 50th anniversary of the Yom Kippur War. To give you another example of a famous date from history that we in the West ignored, but certainly was not ignored by violent Islamists, which sadly is the way it was practiced by the founder of the religion, Muhammad. We in the United States, we in the West, look at 9/11, September 11th of 2001, and the significance of that date being 911, which is the number that we call here for emergency services, similar to 999 in the UK. 911, when we need immediate help from EMTs or police, that's the number we call. But 9/11 had special significance in the Islamic world. You go back to the year 1683, 60 years after the first English colonists landed at Plymouth Rock here in the United States. The forces of the Ottoman Empire had encircled the city of Vienna, Austria, really the gateway to Western Europe, had besieged the city for 2 months and were on the verge of breaking through the city walls and taking the city. Rome to the south, the German states to the north, France to the west would have been wide open to the forces of Islam if it had fallen. But on September 11th of 1683, the winged hussars, the heavy cavalry of the Polish king Jan Sobieski, approached from the north and descended on the Ottoman forces, taking them by surprise, routing them and saving the city of Vienna, and in all likelihood saving Western Europe from the forces of Islam in 1683. That day, September 11th, still remembered by Islamists, even though we in the West have forgotten it. Well, this 50th anniversary of Yom Kippur should not have, the Yom Kippur War of 1973 should not have taken anyone by surprise, in Israel, certainly. And again, that the question of why this happened will certainly be addressed in the days and weeks to come once the situation has settled. And we ask you to pray for the peace of Israel, to pray the peace of Jerusalem. And again, that these families that have been separated or lost loved ones would be comforted and restored as quickly as possible. I will have more on Monday's 5 and 10 update. And until then, thank you for watching. I'm Derek Gilbert. This is Skywatch TV.